Good evening and welcome back, wherever you are listening from, tucked into bed, relaxing after a long day, or simply searching for a gentle story. You've even found a quiet place where history whispers instead of shouts. And if you stay with me until the very end, I'll share some fascinating little facts you won't want to miss. In a world where time itself has always slipped through human hands like sand, there was once a dream to capture eternity, to hold it steady, to measure it with gears and stones rather than with stars and shadows. Tonight, we will drift into the story of history's strangest invention, the clock that measured eternity. Before we begin this journey together, if you find comfort in these stories whispered across the ages, I invite you to gently press the like button and subscribe so you can always return to this quiet corner of history. In the comments, share the time where you are watching and perhaps the city or country from which you listen. It is always soothing to know how far our stories reach. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let yourself drift into history. There is something profoundly human about the attempt to measure time, for long before the modern clock ticked in quiet rooms, people looked upward and watched the heavens as their grandest calendar, charting the steady march of the sun across the sky, the waxing and waning of the moon, the slow dance of constellations that shifted from season to season. And in those patterns, they built their lives, planting seeds, celebrating harvests, waging wars, and making peace in rhythm with celestial cycles. Yet beneath that reliance upon the cosmos, there grew a hunger, a restlessness, to not only observe time, but to contain it, to capture it in an object, a device, a structure that might echo the endlessness of the universe itself. And from that longing would emerge one of the strangest and most ambitious creations of the human imagination. A clock not of hours and minutes, but of millennia. A clock that sought to measure eternity. To understand the magnitude of this dream, we must step back, far back into the oldest roots of human civilization, where timekeeping began not with ticking mechanisms, but with fire, water, and stone. For ancient people carved marks into bones to track the cycles of the moon. They built great stone circles, such as Stonehenge, to capture the rising sun at solstices. They filled bowls with water and let it drip in careful measures to time ceremonies and rituals. And all of these were fragile beginnings, crude yet wondrous, because each whispered the same question: how can we hold time still? In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded the passing of hours, with shadow clocks measuring daylight with thin rods planted in the earth. And in Egypt, obelisks rose like frozen beams of sunlight, towering markers of shifting shadows, while in China, inventors filled bronze vessels with water that dripped into measuring bowls, using the steady rhythm of drops to give order to a world that otherwise flowed ungoverned. And though each culture created different devices, the spirit was the same, a yearning for permanence, for certainty in the river of change. As centuries turned, that yearning grew into marvels, such as the Antikythera mechanism, an astonishing device pulled from a Greek shipwreck, whose bronze gears, though corroded by salt and centuries, revealed calculations of celestial movements so intricate that they seemed almost otherworldly, a fragment of genius surviving from a forgotten workshop. And in its teeth and wheels, we glimpse the idea that humanity could create machines not only to measure the heavens, but to echo their eternal cycles. Yet even these wonders did not satisfy the deepest longing. Because sundials failed in darkness, water clocks ran dry gears, corroded empires fell, and with them their instruments of time faded into dust, leaving the same eternal challenge. Could there ever be a clock that endured beyond kingdoms, beyond centuries, beyond even civilizations, a clock that would outlast its makers and still turn silently long after their names were forgotten? The medieval world pressed onward with this quest, filling monasteries with ringing bells that marked the hours of prayer, building towers with heavy weights and iron wheels that turned steadily, measuring not the eternity of the stars, but the rhythm of earthly days. And these clocks became the heartbeat of towns, steady companions of bakers, merchants, and monks. Yet even then, gears broke, towers crumbled, and fires consumed cities, reminding everyone that timepieces were mortal, no more eternal than the hands that wound them. But always there remained dreamers who looked beyond the temporary, who asked themselves whether it was possible to make a clock that did not serve only the present, but that spoke across the vastness of years. And from those dreamers would emerge ideas that were more philosophy than engineering, visions of machines that could mark not days or years, but entire ages of humanity. Some whispered of devices hidden in temples, clocks of stone or crystal that kept silent watch beneath desert sands or mountain halls, guardians of forgotten knowledge waiting to be uncovered. And though many of these were only myths, their persistence told us something important: that the idea of a clock measuring eternity had become a legend in itself, a story that stretched from generation to generation, growing richer with each telling. Tonight, as we trace this story, we will follow those legends into the places where history and imagination intertwine through inventions both real and rumored, until we reach the astonishing modern project that finally attempted to fulfill the ancient dream: the building of a clock designed to measure 10,000 years, turning silently in the desert, waiting patiently as empires rise and fall. But before we arrive at that creation, we must journey through the ages of human wonder and failure, through the myths of hidden devices and the true machines that almost touched eternity. For only by understanding the long story of timekeeping can we truly grasp why anyone would dare to build the strangest invention of all, a clock not for people, but for eternity itself. As we drift deeper into the tale, imagine the world as it appeared in the ancient and medieval mind, a place where time was less a number on a dial and more a living presence that breathed with the seasons, where days lengthened and shortened with the sun, where winter carried silence and stillness, and where summer pulsed with labor and abundance. And into this world, the earliest clockmakers introduced not only their tools, but their philosophies, for they were not merely craftsmen, but interpreters of eternity, trying to take the vast, incomprehensible flow of existence and compress it into the gentle tick of a mechanism. And in their hands, time became something tangible, a wheel that could be turned, a weight that could be lifted, a balance that could be set into steady motion. And with each invention, humanity came one step closer to believing it might actually trap eternity within the body of a machine. The great tower clocks of medieval Europe were more than instruments. They were symbols of order, monuments of stone and iron standing in town square, proclaiming the authority of communities to master their days. And when their bells rang out across valleys and rooftops, it was not only a measure of hours, but a declaration that life could be structured, that the chaos of existence could be soothed by the promise of regularity. And yet, in that same ringing, there was always a reminder of impermanence, for the bells rusted, the wood splintered, the iron bent, and sooner or later, the clock would falter, its voice would fade, and the townspeople would be left once again with the silence of unmeasured time. But whispers of greater dreams persisted, traveling across continents, for in the east the Chinese were already centuries ahead, building elaborate astronomical clocks with towering water wheels and celestial spheres that turned in perfect harmony. Devices so ambitious that they mirrored not only the flow of hours, but the grand design of the heavens themselves. And when scholars stood before these machines, watching miniature suns and moons glide across gilded arcs, they were not simply keeping time, they were glimpsing eternity contained within human artifice, a fragment of the universe itself tamed and displayed within gears and levers. In Baghdad, too, during the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, engineers crafted water clocks of exquisite beauty fountains that gurgled in rhythm with the minutes, automata that chimed, figurines that moved in delicate synchrony. And though many of these wonders are lost to us now, their descriptions breathe with awe, telling us that the quest for eternity was never the dream of one land or one people, but a shared longing of humanity itself. Yet always the same truth emerged. No matter how splendid, how ambitious, how carefully crafted each machine decayed, its copper tarnished, its iron corroded, its wood eaten by time's slow hunger. And this created in every age the same haunting question: could any device survive long enough to truly outlast the people who built it? In some stories, the answer seemed almost within reach, for travelers returned from distant lands with tales of clocks hidden in temples that had ticked for centuries without human touch of mechanism, humming deep within caverns of sacred relics that kept time not for mortals, but for gods. And while modern historians treat many of these stories as legend, one cannot help but notice the persistence of the myth, how across cultures and centuries people continued to imagine that somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the world, a clock that measured eternity already existed, waiting silently for rediscovery. Perhaps these myths endured because they spoke to something deeper than mechanics, to the human desire not to be forgotten. For in building such a clock, there was always more at stake than measuring days. It was about leaving behind proof that humanity itself had once existed, that someone, somewhere, at some time, had reached out and dared to leave. A mark that would last beyond the crumbling of cities and the fading of names. By the time the Renaissance dawned, this longing intertwined with new philosophies. For as art and science blossomed across Europe, clockmakers refined their craft into exquisite machines of brass and steel, each more precise than the last, each aspiring to perfection. And yet, alongside this precision, there grew a sense of melancholy, a recognition that no matter how finely tuned, the clocks themselves were as mortal as their makers. And so scholars began to dream once more of something greater, a clock that would not simply mark human hours, but would echo the eternity of the cosmos itself. This dream was nurtured quietly past, like a candle from one mind to another, until at last, centuries later, it would take on a new form in an age obsessed with technology and permanence. When engineers and visionaries would decide to build in the silence of a desert a machine that might finally fulfill the ancient ambition to measure eternity, not in myth, but in metal and stone. To reach the next stage of our journey, we must pause in the Renaissance, for it was here, in the candlelit workshops of Europe, that the craft of clockmaking blossomed into both art and science, where delicate gears were polished until they gleamed like mirrors, where instruments clicked with the patience of monks, and where small, ticking devices began to appear not only in towers but in homes, each one promising a private glimpse into the ordered passage of time. And yet, in this moment of triumph, there also grew an unease. For philosophers began to sense that the more precisely humans measured the hours, the more painfully they felt them slip away. And so the paradox of the clock deepened. For the same machine that offered mastery also whispered of mortality, reminding every listener that eternity could not be owned, only borrowed. It was in this atmosphere that new ideas of eternity began to stir, ideas that looked upward once again to the heavens, because the clockmakers of the Renaissance were not satisfied with telling the hour of the day. They wanted to map the universe itself, and thus were born the great astronomical clocks, immense constructions in which brass suns and silver moons revolved upon painted skies, where angels pointed to the hour, while zodiac signs marched endlessly around gilded circles. And when citizens gathered to watch these machines perform their hourly shows, they felt something greater than entertainment. They felt that they were standing in the presence of eternity rendered visible, as if the universe itself had allowed its secrets to be captured and displayed behind glass and stone. In Prague, in Strasbourg, in countless towns where such marvels rose, people craned their necks and wondered whether perhaps humanity had finally succeeded in touching the infinite. And yet, behind the beauty, the same truth lingered. 4 wheels wore down, teeth snapped, and custodians struggled constantly to repair what time was always undoing. The Renaissance also awakened a new sense of history, and with it, a fascination for ancient machines. 4 scholars began to rediscover Greek and Roman texts that spoke of lost devices, and one story, above all, captured their imagination: the account of a water-driven organ and clock presented by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid to Charlemagne in the 8th century, a gift that had astonished its European recipients with its mysterious song and its seemingly magical measurement of time. And though that machine was lost, the memory of it lingered like a ghost in the minds of inventors, a reminder that across cultures and across ages, the dream of an eternal clock had always resurfaced. Slowly, as the centuries passed, clockmaking became more precise, more mathematical, and yet somehow less ambitious in its philosophical scope. For pocket watches and pendulum clocks, though elegant, served practical ends, marking the workday, the voyage, the experiment. And while they refined human control over minutes and seconds, they no longer sought to capture eternity itself. And so the ancient dream seemed to fade, retreating into legend, lingering only in the tales of forgotten mechanisms and mythical timekeepers. Yet, even in this fading, seeds were planted, for as science advanced, the question of time grew ever more profound, and new thinkers began to wonder whether eternity could be measured not by hours or by the stars, but by forces deeper still, by the heartbeat of the earth itself, by the rhythm of celestial cycles that stretched not for centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. It was this renewed vision that would eventually give birth to the idea of building not simply a clock, but a monument that would mark the passage of time so slowly, so deliberately, that it would outlast nations, languages, perhaps even civilizations. A machine whose very purpose was to remind those who saw it that humanity was but a visitor in the vastness of eternity. This seed of an idea would wait patiently, like a buried gear, until modern visionaries found it and dared to shape it into reality. But before we reach their bold project, we must wander further still, into the labyrinth of myths and mysteries that accompanied timekeeping. For history is filled with whispered tales of strange devices that may have existed, machines that appeared in chronicles only to vanish without trace. And it is within these twilight stories that the dream of eternity continued to survive, hidden beneath layers of dust and disbelief, waiting to be awakened. As we follow the thread of legends, we find ourselves wandering into the hushed corridors of forgotten chronicles, where strange machines are described with reverence and awe, where travelers speak of clocks that no hand ever wound and that no rust ever claimed. And although historians often dismiss these tales as exaggerations or allegories, they nonetheless reveal how deeply the dream of an eternal timekeeper haunted the human imagination. For across cultures, there linger stories of devices that seemed to whisper of eternity itself, glimmers of machines that might have bridged the gap between myth and reality. There are accounts, for instance, of a clock said to have been hidden in a Byzantine monastery, one that measured not hours, but the cycles of creation, its wheels turning so slowly that a single revolution required centuries. And though no physical trace of it has ever been uncovered, the story endured, passed from one monk to another, as a reminder that faith and science often intersected in humanity's desire to make sense of eternity. In the manuscripts of Arabic scholars, we also read of fantastical automata, fountains that moved in rhythm with the stars and towers that displayed the heavens in intricate mechanical dance. And while many of these descriptions blur the line between reality and metaphor, they kept alive the notion that somewhere, somehow, it was possible to bind the universe into a machine that would outlast its creators. In medieval Europe, pilgrims returning from distant journeys carried stories of ancient temples where guardians spoke of clocks hidden beneath stone floors, devices that had ticked since the days of Alexander. And though these whispers were often dismissed as superstition, they spread nonetheless, weaving into the fabric of popular imagination. The legend of the perpetual clock became so persistent that even serious philosophers considered whether such a device might exist, and this speculation led to the birth of the perpetual motion debate, a centuries-long pursuit of machines that would turn forever, without fuel or winding devices that could mimic eternity itself. And though physics would eventually reveal the impossibility of such contraptions, the very persistence of the dream showed how unwilling humanity was to release its longing to hold time captive. Even alchemists, who sought the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, sometimes turned their attention to time, writing in cryptic texts of gears that mirrored the heavens, of instruments that promised not eternal youth, but eternal remembrance. And though most of their works are lost, burned, or dismissed, fragments remain, hinting that in secret chambers lit by flickering candles, men and women once dreamed of clocks that could measure ages rather than moments. These myths gained new fuel during the age of exploration, when sailors and merchants returned with stories of strange devices glimpsed in distant lands, such as a tale of an ancient mechanism in India that was said to predict eclipses with uncanny accuracy, or a whisper of a great wheel in China that turned once every 1,000 years. And whether true or false, such accounts added to the growing conviction that somewhere beyond the known world, someone had already succeeded in building the clock that measured eternity. But perhaps the most haunting of all these tales is the story of the so-called clock of the ancients, a mythical device described in fragments across cultures always with slight variations, but always with the same essence, a mechanism buried deep within the earth, designed not to serve its makers, but to speak to those who would come long after, a silent guardian of time, waiting patiently in the shadows. And though no evidence of such a clock has ever been uncovered, the legend persists, repeated in hushed tones by those who wonder whether myths are sometimes memories, distorted echoes of real creations long since lost. What these legends reveal, more than any single invention, is the persistence of human yearning. For in every age, from the monks of Byzantium to the sailors of the Renaissance, people returned to the same idea, that eternity might somehow be touched, that a device could be fashioned to outlast the fall of empires, that a machine could stand as testimony that humanity was once here, alive, dreaming, striving, reaching for the infinite. And though most of these stories remained only as words upon fragile parchment, or as whispers exchanged around firelight, they were not wasted, for they kept the dream alive through centuries of doubt, ensuring that when the modern age arrived, filled with new tools, new metals, and new ambitions, visionaries would still carry within their hearts the ancient longing to create a clock that would measure not merely time, but eternity itself. As the myths of forgotten clocks and whispered legends drifted into the background of history, the world slowly entered an age when observation began to outweigh superstition, when men and women no longer looked only to sacred texts or oral traditions to explain the mysteries of time, but instead turned their gaze to the stars with instruments of brass and glass, recording, calculating, and daring to believe that the universe could be measured with precision rather than wonder alone. And it was during this transformation that the dream of an eternal clock gained new life, not as myth, but as a serious pursuit rooted in science. For if time could be measured with exactness, then perhaps it could also be preserved, stretched, and recorded in ways no generation had achieved before. The Renaissance had awakened a hunger for knowledge, and with it came the invention of increasingly sophisticated clocks devices that not only told the hour, but reflected the harmony of the cosmos, like the great astronomical clocks that graced the cathedrals of Prague and Strasbourg, vast machines that displayed the dance of the planets and the phases of the moon alongside the passage of minutes, reminding all who gazed upon them that time was not a mere human invention, but a cosmic truth written into the fabric of creation itself. These clocks were not eternal in the literal sense, yet to those who marveled at them, they seemed to reach beyond the mundane tick of ordinary hours, offering a glimpse of eternity through their intricate turning wheels and silent, steady movements, and, for a time, they satisfied the longing that had animated myths for centuries. Yet, as mechanical mastery advanced, so too did the questions grow sharper, for inventors and philosophers began to ask whether it might be possible to design a clock that would run not merely for years or decades, but for millennia, a clock that would not falter with the weakness of springs or the exhaustion of oil, a clock that would remain steadfast through storms of history, through the crumbling of kingdoms and the rise of nations, a clock whose steady rhythm might continue long after its builders had turned to dust. This yearning was sharpened by the growing awareness of human fragility, for plagues, wars, and famines reminded each generation that individual lives were fleeting, and even empires that seemed eternal could vanish almost overnight, leaving behind only ruins and fragments. Against this backdrop, the idea of an eternal timekeeper became not only an expression of wonder, but a kind of defiance. a declaration that human thought and human craft could reach beyond the grave, could leave behind a monument that no catastrophe might erase. It was in this period that the debate over perpetual motion machines reached its height, with countless inventors presenting schemes of wheels that would turn forever, of pendulums that would never lose, momentum of fountains that would flow without end. And although physics had not yet developed the tools to explain why such dreams were impossible, the persistence of these attempts revealed the deeper truth that humanity's hunger for eternity was unquenchable. Some machines seemed convincing for a time, spinning under the gaze of kings and scholars, yet eventually every one of them stilled, betrayed by the immutable laws of energy. And yet the failure of these devices did not extinguish the dream, but rather redirected it, teaching inventors that eternity could not be achieved through trickery or illusion, but might still be approached through careful design, durable materials, and a new philosophy of patience. By the 17th century, thinkers such as Galileo and Huygens had transformed the science of timekeeping with the invention of the pendulum clock, a device of unprecedented accuracy. And with this precision came a new awareness of how long a clock might endure if cared for properly, inspiring speculation that perhaps a machine could be built to last centuries, so long as it was designed with eternity in mind. The Enlightenment further amplified this desire, for philosophers began to speak not only of the rights of man or the progress of reason, but of the destiny of civilization itself, a destiny that required thinking beyond the span of a single generation. And in their writings, we can trace the faint outlines of the modern idea of long-term thinking. The belief that our works should be judged not only by their immediate usefulness, but by the legacy they leave for those who will live in distant centuries. Slowly, the myths of eternal clocks transformed into plans, sketches, and blueprints, some fanciful, others practical. And though most remained unrealized, they prepared the soil for the great projects to come. For as Europe expanded into the wider world, bringing with it both conquest and curiosity, the idea of a clock that could measure eternity began to shift from dream to possible reality, no longer bound to monasteries or legends, but tied to the emerging vision of humanity as a species capable of shaping not only its present, but its future. And in the quiet ticking of these early clocks, in the patient work of artisans and astronomers, one can hear the faint but steady footsteps of a story that would one day culminate in a machine, unlike any before it, a clock designed not merely to tell the time, but to hold eternity in its heart. As the 17th century yielded to the 18th, and the great flowering of the Enlightenment matured into the age of industry, humanity's relationship with time began to change in ways that would have seemed unimaginable to the monks who once whispered of eternal clocks, or to the artisans who crafted cathedral marvels. For the Industrial Revolution brought not only machines of power and production, but also a profound shift in how ordinary people measured and experienced the passing of their days. And suddenly, time was no longer a celestial rhythm marked by bells or the slow turning of astronomical dials, but a regimented, relentless force that governed labor, transport, and every corner of human life. Factories demanded punctuality, trains demanded synchronization, and the expansion of empires demanded timetables that stretched across continents. So the humble clock, once a luxury of courts and cathedrals, became a common companion in homes, workshops, and even the pockets of working men and women, binding society together with the invisible threads of shared hours. Yet even as time became more practical, and more omnipresent, the ancient dream of eternity lingered, transformed, but not extinguished. Four thinkers and inventors began to ask whether the mastery of industry and engineering might finally allow them to create machines that would endure not merely for decades, but for centuries, monuments to human craft that could outlast even the industries they served. The very concept of long-term design was given new urgency by the speed of change. For as coal and iron reshaped landscapes and steam engines shrieked across the countryside, there was a dawning awareness that progress was both a marvel and a danger, that the same forces that could propel humanity forward might also erase the past with frightening swiftness. And so the desire to preserve, to hold something constant in the storm of change grew all the stronger. In quiet laboratories, engineers tinkered with mechanisms that promised durability, with jeweled bearings that reduced friction and metals that resisted corrosion, dreaming of clocks that could continue their patient work long after their inventors had been forgotten. At the same time, philosophers and poets spoke of time in new tones, not only as a measure of industry, but as a measure of destiny, warning that humanity must learn to think beyond the fleeting moment, lest it destroy the very foundations upon which it stood. And in this atmosphere, the idea of an eternal clock became something more than curiosity or legend. It became a symbol of stability in a world hurtling into the unknown. Some inventors, intoxicated by the spirit of perpetual progress, returned to the old dream of perpetual motion, convinced that steam or magnetism might at last unlock the key that earlier centuries had failed to discover. And although every attempt collapsed under the laws of physics, the persistence of these efforts revealed a deeper truth. The hunger for eternity was now being fed by the confidence of industry, by the belief that no problem was beyond human ingenuity, that the future itself could be engineered. And though the perfect eternal machine remained elusive, this confidence gave rise to a new kind of ambition, not simply to create devices that would run forever, but to design systems and structures intended to endure across generations, from libraries that preserved knowledge for posterity to monuments that declared the permanence of progress. The clock, humble yet profound, stood at the center of this transformation, no longer only a tool of measurement, but a metaphor for modernity itself, embodying both the promise of order and the anxiety of acceleration. For as machines ticked faster and faster, humanity was forced to confront the uneasy truth that in seeking to master time, it was also becoming enslaved to it. And yet, in the shadow of this paradox, the old dream remained: to create a clock that would not race with industry, but endure beyond it, to craft a mechanism that would continue its patient rhythm long after smokestacks had fallen silent and rails had rusted, to offer to the distant future a reminder that amid the frenzy of progress, there were those who thought not only of the next moment, but of eternity. Thus, as the 19th century drew to its close and the world entered an age of unparalleled change, the dream of the eternal clock was not forgotten, but quietly passed from legend into the hands of engineers and philosophers who would carry it into the modern age, laying the final stones on the path that would one day lead to the creation of a clock designed not merely to mark hours, but to measure eternity itself. As the 19th century faded and the 20th century dawned, humanity entered a turbulent era where time itself seemed to fracture. For no century before had seen such rapid acceleration, such breathtaking leaps forward in technology, and yet such profound destruction. And it was within this paradox that the dream of the eternal clock took on new urgency. For the old desire to outlast mortality was now joined by the awareness that civilization itself might not endure unless humanity learned to think beyond the immediate. The two world wars shattered illusions of permanence, reducing cities that had stood for centuries to rubble in a single night, reminding all who survived that human achievements, however grand, could vanish in the blink of an eye. And in the aftermath of such devastation, the idea of creating something that could endure across millennia became not only a marvel, but a necessity, a way to assert that humanity's story would not be erased by its own violence. At the same time, technology was advancing at a pace that dwarfed earlier centuries. For radios, airplanes, and later, computers redefined not only how people lived, but how they perceived time, shrinking distances and compressing communication into seconds. And with this new acceleration came an unsettling awareness that the rhythms of human life were drifting ever further from the patient cycles of the natural world. Scientists, poets, and visionaries began to speak openly of the dangers of short-term thinking, warning that if progress continued without foresight, the very foundations of civilization might collapse beneath its own weight. And thus the notion of building for the long term, of creating a legacy that could speak to people not yet born, began to emerge not as an eccentric dream, but as a cultural imperative. It was in this climate that the seeds of the long now were planted, though the term itself would not be coined until much later for scattered. Across the century were thinkers who dared to ask what it would mean to design, not for 10 years or even 100, but for 10,000. Museums and archives attempted to preserve not only art and artifacts, but knowledge itself, creating vaults and microfilm stores intended to resist the decay of centuries, while scientists began to speculate about sending messages to the far future, perhaps even to civilizations beyond Earth, in the form of satellites that might orbit long after humanity was gone. The launch of the Voyager probes in the 1970s carried golden records etched with the sounds and languages of Earth, intended not for immediate discovery, but for listeners who might encounter them millions of years hence. And in this symbolic act, one can see the same impulse that drove the myths of Byzantine monks or the ambitions of Enlightenment clockmakers, the longing to speak across eternity, to leave behind a message that outlasts both wars and lifetimes. Yet even as humanity looked outward to the stars, there were those who turned inward, reflecting that, before we could hope to speak to distant civilizations, we must first learn to communicate with our own future generations. And this required a radical shift in perspective, a willingness to imagine a timescale that stretched beyond nations, beyond economies, beyond the feverish cycles of progress that defined the modern age. Philosophers like Stuart Brand began to articulate the need for what he called the long now, a state of mind that placed the present within the vast sweep of the past and the unimaginable expanse of the future, encouraging humanity to see itself not as a creature of fleeting decades, but as a participant in a story that might last for tens of thousands of years. And from this vision emerged the idea that to truly embody long-term thinking, one must create physical symbols of endurance, artifacts that could remind each new generation of the vastness of time and the responsibility to those who would inherit the earth. In this crucible of war, wonder, and worry, the ancient dream of the clock that measured eternity began to shift once again, preparing to take physical form in the modern era. no longer as myth, no longer as allegory, but as a machine designed with steel and stone, built to tick for 10,000 years, and to stand as both a marvel and a warning, a gentle but insistent voice reminding us that eternity is not only a mystery to be pondered, but a responsibility to be embraced. In the closing years of the 20th century, when computers had already begun to hum in every office and satellites circled silently overhead, the dream of the eternal clock at last began to take tangible form, not as a legend whispered by monks, nor as an impossible scheme of perpetual motion, but as a deliberate project conceived by thinkers who wished to remind humanity of its place within deep time. And at the heart of this movement stood Stuart Brand, a writer and visionary who had long challenged the short-term habits of modern society, encouraging people to see beyond the narrow horizons of quarterly reports and election cycles. Brand, together with computer scientist Danny Hillis, recognized that humanity was racing ever faster, building technologies that reshaped daily life in the span of years, yet rarely pausing to ask how these inventions might be judged by those who would inherit the world centuries from now. And so they imagined a device that could act as a counterweight to this acceleration. A clock designed not to govern daily routines, but to serve as a silent reminder of the vastness of time, a monument that could endure for 10,000 years. Hillis, who had made his mark in computing, found himself dreaming of a clock that would tick once every year, with a hand that moved once every century, and a chime that would sound once every millennium. A machine so slow that it would stretch the imagination, forcing those who encountered it to think not of their own lifetimes, but of ages beyond counting. This vision soon took root in the formation of the Long Now Foundation, an organization dedicated to fostering long-term responsibility, and the clock became its central project, both symbol and tool, designed to inspire a sense of stewardship across generations. Unlike earlier dreams of perpetual motion, this clock was not meant to defy physics, but to work with it, drawing upon principles of durability, simplicity, and patience, constructed from materials chosen to withstand erosion, corrosion, and the forgetfulness of time. The plan was to house it within a mountain, hidden from casual destruction, yet accessible to those who sought it, a place where future generations might climb and listen to the slow heartbeat of civilization. In the design, one can hear echoes of ancient myths and medieval marvels, for though the technology was modern, the impulse was timeless. To create a device that outlasted its makers, to offer the future a message of continuity and care. The clock was never meant to serve as a practical timekeeper, for no one would consult it to know the hour of day, but rather as a work of philosophy in steel and stone, a meditation embodied in gears and shafts, whispering across centuries that humanity must widen its view, must think in terms of millennia rather than moments. Those involved in its creation spoke often of how fragile civilization truly is, how quickly the noise of modernity might vanish into silence. And they hoped that the clock would be a kind of anchor, a way to tether the present to a longer horizon. Engineers grappled with questions no ordinary clockmaker ever considered. How to keep a mechanism legible to people thousands of years in the future, who might no longer share our languages or symbols. How to build components that required no oil or maintenance, yet would resist dust and decay. How to design for a future that might be unimaginably different, yet still human at its core. These challenges were not simply technical, but philosophical, for every choice carried within it an assumption about the persistence of humanity, about whether people 10,000 years hence would still climb mountains, still recognize beauty in the slow turning of a gear, still care to hear the chime of a clock built by ancestors they had never known. In this sense, the clock of the long now was as much a mirror as it was a mechanism reflecting not only our hopes for the future, but our fears of impermanence. And in its patient design, we can hear the echo of that ancient longing, the desire that once gave birth to myths of Byzantine wonders and alchemical machines now reborn in the age of silicon and steel. Thus, as the 20th century drew to its close, humanity finally stood upon the threshold of realizing the dream of the eternal clock, not as fantasy, but as reality, a project poised to carry forward into the new millennium, quietly ticking in the dark, inviting all who would listen to step into the vast expanse of the long now, deep within the arid hills of western Texas, where the landscape stretches in silent, rugged folds beneath an endless sky. The dream of the eternal clock finally began to take on its monumental form, not as a sketch in a notebook, nor a metaphor in a book of philosophy, but as an immense physical structure carved into the living body of a mountain, a place chosen for its isolation, its durability, and its atmosphere of timelessness. For the desert has a way of reminding visitors that human lives are brief and the earth is patient. It was here that engineers, artisans, and visionaries gathered to begin the construction of the clock of the long now, a device unlike any the world had seen before, for it was intended not merely to tell time, but to embody time itself, to whisper its steady rhythm across the span of 10,000 years. The scale of the project was staggering, for every piece of the design had to be conceived not for decades or even centuries, but for millennia, and this demanded a kind of patience and imagination that seemed almost alien in a world accustomed to instant gratification and rapid cycles of innovation. To build a clock that could last so long required not only extraordinary engineering, but a philosophy of humility, for the designers knew that they would never live to see the clock complete its journey, that their own names might be forgotten, even as the machine they built continued its patient ticking, carrying their vision forward into centuries yet unborn. The mountain itself became both the cradle and the guardian of the clock, chosen because stone outlasts, steel because silence protects better than fame, because a mechanism hidden within the bones of the earth has a chance to endure where monuments exposed to wind and war might crumble. The entrance set into the desert slope leads to a tunnel that winds upward through chambers cut by both machine and hand, each step carrying the visitor deeper into a place where time feels slower, where echoes linger in the air, and where the hum of the outside world fades into quiet reverence. Within these chambers, the components of the clock are assembled: enormous gears, taller than men, shafts of gleaming metal designed to resist corrosion, counterweights that will shift with a patience that defies imagination, and dials that will move so slowly that a single glance cannot reveal their change. The clock is designed to tick only once each year, its century hand advancing with a solemn inevitability. And at the turning of a millennium, a chime will sound a note of music carried into the cavern, resonating against stone, heard perhaps by those who will live in an age we cannot yet conceive. The design of the clock reflects a profound respect for the laws of physics and the lessons of history, for it is not a perpetual motion machine that pretends to defy entropy, but a device carefully balanced to work with natural forces powered by temperature, changes between day and night by the patient descent of weights, by principles of mechanical resilience honed through centuries of craftsmanship. Every surface has been chosen with care, every material selected for endurance. For in 10,000 years, steel may rust and wood may rot, but stone and ceramic can remain. And so the builders sought materials that might speak across deep time. Even the interface of the clock, the way its workings will be read, was designed with the future in mind. For those who encounter it may not speak our languages or share our symbols, and so the dials are marked with astronomical patterns, with the positions of stars and the movements of celestial bodies that will remain constant long after nations have risen and fallen. For the sky itself is the one book that every generation can read. The challenges of construction were immense, not only technical, but philosophical. For how does one build for people 10,000 years in the future, when one cannot predict the fashions of 10 years ahead, the technologies of 100, the beliefs of 1,000? And yet, this was precisely the point, for the clock was meant not to predict the future, but to respect it, to acknowledge that the people who will come after us are real, that their lives matter, and that we have an obligation to leave them more than ruins. To enter the clock's chambers is to step into a dialogue with eternity, for the slow turning of its gears is not meant to serve our daily schedules, but to remind us that we are part of a story far larger than ourselves. That time does not belong to us alone, but stretches forward and backward in endless procession. The clock's guardians hope that future generations will climb the mountain to see it, that they will feel the same hush that visitors feel today, that they will be reminded of the fragility of civilization and the endurance of the earth. And perhaps most of all, that they will be inspired to think in terms of the long now, to make decisions not only for themselves, but for the generations who will inherit the consequences. The symbolism of the clock is as important as its mechanics. For in a world dominated by speed, by the constant refresh of news, and the ticking of digital seconds, the clock of the long now offers a counterpoint, a reminder that slowness can be profound, that patience is a virtue not only of individuals, but of civilizations, that to survive, we must learn to think in horizons beyond our own lifetimes. It is a work of art as much as engineering, a piece of philosophy forged in steel and stone, a monument not to conquest or wealth, but to foresight. And in this sense, it stands in the lineage of the great pyramids, the cathedrals, and the astronomical clocks of earlier ages. Yet with a difference, it is not a monument to the power of rulers or the glory of God, but to the idea of responsibility itself. Those who built it do not claim to know what the world will look like in 10,000 years, but they believe that by leaving behind this slow, steady heartbeat, they can remind the future that they were once here, that they cared enough to think of those yet to come, that they reached beyond the horizon of their own lives to measure eternity. And so the clock of the long now rises within the mountain, still incomplete, still a work in progress, but already a presence that humbles those who see it, already a whisper that calls us to widen our view, to slow our pace, to remember that time is both fleeting and infinite, that we are both temporary and eternal. Each massive gear, each careful engraving, each chamber carved into stone speaks not only of human ingenuity, but of human hope, the hope that amid wars and storms, amid the chaos of history, there can remain a steady rhythm, a clock that measures eternity not to enslave us, but to remind us of our place within it. To imagine the moment when the millennium chime sounds is to step into a future almost beyond comprehension. To think of people who will stand in that chamber, perhaps changed in ways we cannot guess, yet still human, still listening, still hearing the echo of a vision born in our own age. And in that imagined moment, the past and the future touch, and eternity itself seems almost within reach. When we arrive at the final chapter of the story of the clock that measures eternity, it is not the gears, nor the shafts of metal, nor even the great chamber carved into the mountain that hold our attention, but the profound question that has lingered since the beginning of human thought. Why do we yearn so deeply to outlast ourselves? Why do we dream of machines that can keep ticking when our own hearts have long since stilled? Why do we pour so much labor, imagination, and sacrifice into a device that none of us will live to see complete its journey? And perhaps the answer lies not in the machine itself, but in the mirror it holds up to us. For the clock of the long now is not truly about minutes or hours, nor even about years and centuries, but about perspective, about the widening of the human mind from the immediacy of the present to the sweep of deep time. And when we look upon it, we are reminded that the world does not belong to us alone, that we share it with the billions who came before and the countless who will come after, that we are temporary stewards of something immeasurably vast. To stand before its slow, patient gears is to feel the humbling truth that our own lives are but a moment, that the stories we live and the struggles we endure are but single threads in a tapestry that stretches across millennia. And yet this realization need not bring despair, but can instead bring comfort. For it means that even though our days are fleeting, they are woven into something enduring, something far greater than ourselves. The clock asks us to imagine people thousands of years from now walking into its chamber, perhaps in clothes and customs unimaginable to us, perhaps carrying tools and beliefs shaped by centuries we will never see, and yet pausing to listen to the same slow rhythm that we hear today. And in that pause, across the abyss of time, there will be a connection, a silent conversation between generations separated by oceans of history, yet united by the simple fact of being human. It is this imagined encounter that gives the clock its deepest meaning. For it is not only a machine, but a message, a promise written in steel and stone that says to the future we thought of you, we built. This for you, we cared enough to imagine your existence, even when we could not imagine your world. In this way, the clock stands as an antidote to forgetfulness, a reminder that the present is not the end of the story, but a chapter in an ongoing book, and that our choices today ripple outward into centuries we will never see. Yet the clock is also a paradox, for while it is built to last 10,000 years, it is equally possible that it may be forgotten, that it may sit in silence while civilizations rise and fall, that it may be rediscovered by people who no longer know its origin, who may weave new myths around its gears. Just as monks once whispered of ancient perpetual machines, and perhaps this too is part of its destiny, to become once again legend, a story told by firelight of a clock hidden in the mountains that measures eternity. If so, then the circle is complete, for myths gave birth to the dream, and the dream gave birth to the machine, and the machine may one day return to myth, carried forward not by precision engineering, but by the human need to tell stories that outlast death. In this light, the clock becomes not only a device, but a living participant in the cycle of memory and forgetting, a symbol that will mean different things to different ages, yet always with the same core, the longing for permanence in an impermanent world. And so the clock of the long now is not merely history as strangest invention, but also one of its most beautiful, for it speaks, not in the language of power or conquest, but in the language of patience and hope, reminding us that eternity cannot be owned, but can be honored, cannot be conquered, but can be measured with humility. It invites us to slow down, to breathe, to step outside the fever of minutes and the frenzy of years, and to rest for a moment in the calm awareness that time stretches endlessly behind and before us, and that our place within it, though small, is not meaningless. Each tick of its yearly beat is a heartbeat of civilization, each chime of its millennium a reminder that humanity, fragile though it is, has the capacity to think and care beyond the horizon of its own mortality. In this sense, the clock is not only for the future, but for us here and now, teaching us that by looking into eternity, we can also learn how to live more gently, more wisely, more fully in the present. Perhaps one day the clock will fall silent, buried by the collapse of stone or the shifting of earth, its gears stilled, its chambers empty, and yet even then the dream it embodies will not die, for it is the same dream that has guided humanity for millennia, from the builders of pyramids to the makers of cathedrals, from the monks who whispered of eternal clocks to the philosophers who sketched machines that might outlast empires. And that dream is the longing to leave behind a trace, to say in some form, however fragile, we were here. We thought, we hoped, we dreamed. The clock of the long now is simply the latest expression of that eternal longing. A marvel of steel and stone carrying forward a story as old as humanity itself. A story that will continue to be told as long as people gaze at the stars and wonder where they fit within the vastness of time. And so, as we step back from the mountain and watch the desert stretch out beneath the quiet sky, we are reminded that the true measure of eternity is not only in machines or monuments, but in the imagination that dares to reach for it. And in that sense, the clock is not only history's strangest invention, but its most human. When we look at the clock that measures eternity, it is tempting to see only the steel, the stone, and the silent grandeur of a machine designed to outlast empires. Yet behind every invention, no matter how vast, there are always people. The clock is not just the sum of its gears and shafts, but also of the human dreams, doubts, and sacrifices that made it possible. To tell its story without speaking of its makers would be to miss its most human heartbeat. The modern story of the clock begins with Stuart Brand, a man who believed that humanity needed to stretch its sense of time. In the 1960s, Brand had already made his mark with the Whole Earth Catalog, a publication that encouraged readers to think differently about technology, nature, and the tools we use to shape our world. Yet decades later, he saw a new danger emerging, not the lack of technology, but the lack of perspective. Human beings, he feared, were living more and more in the short term, chasing quarterly profits, instant news, and the quick fix of modern convenience. What was being lost was the ability to think in centuries, to see ourselves as stewards of the future. It was Brand who first spoke of building a clock that would tick not in seconds or minutes, but in millennia. A clock so vast and strange that it would remind anyone who encountered it that time does not end with us. Yet he was not an engineer, and so the dream might have remained just a dream, if not for another mind, that of Danny Hillis. Hillis, a computer scientist and inventor, had long been fascinated with the challenge of creating machines that endure, unlike the silicon chips of computers, which degrade in decades. He imagined a mechanism that could last for 10,000 years, not dependent on electricity, not fragile to storms or wars, but something that would move with the quiet patience of nature itself, powered by gravity, temperature shifts, and the turning of the earth. Where most inventors dreamed of speed, Hillis dreamed of slowness. Together, Brand and Hillis gave the clock its foundation. But their ideas could not remain in sketches alone. A project of this magnitude required builders, artisans, funders, and dreamers willing to invest their fleeting lifetimes into something they would never live to see completed. The Long Now Foundation was born, gathering thinkers, philosophers, engineers, and artists who believed in the radical idea of long-term responsibility. Among them were Brian Eno, the musician and thinker who coined the very phrase, the long now, and many others who lent their minds, their money, and their skills to the project. Imagine, for a moment, the workers who cut into the mountain where the clock would one day rest. Day after day, they drilled through ancient rock, their hands guiding tools that bit slowly into stone laid down millions of years before human civilization. These laborers, like the stonemasons of old cathedrals, knew that their names would never be carved into the final work, that future visitors would see only the finished chamber and not the toil it took to create. And yet they continued, shaping a space not for themselves, but for people thousands of years in the future. There is something profoundly humbling about this. In an age when so much of life is measured in hours, deadlines, and instant gratification, the clock demands patience from everyone who touches it. It asks for faith. Faith that even though we may never hear its thousand-year chime, someone else will. But this story is not just about the named visionaries or the anonymous workers of today. It is also about a lineage that stretches backward in time. The clock stands on the shoulders of countless generations who built for the future without ever knowing who would inherit their work. Think of the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt who hauled massive stones into place under the blazing desert sun. They could not imagine that tourists, thousands of years later, would still stand in awe of their creation. Yet they worked on one stone at a time. Think of the cathedral builders of medieval Europe, who laid foundations for spires they would never see complete, whose children and grandchildren would take up the work after them. To build a cathedral was to accept that your own lifetime was only one chapter in a larger story. In monasteries, scribes once bent over parchment, copying texts line by line, often without understanding the language they preserved. They knew only that what they wrote might be needed by someone centuries in the future. In their quiet labor, we see the same impulse that drives the clock, the willingness to give a piece of one's life to something that will outlast it. The clock, then, is not a machine that stands apart from humanity, but a mirror of what humanity has always done when at its best. We are builders of bridges across time. We plant trees, knowing we will never sit in their shade. We write books, knowing we may never meet the readers. We raise children who will live in a world we cannot fully imagine. The clock simply makes this impulse visible, turning it into gears and stone, a physical embodiment of the promise we try to make to the future. Of course, not everyone believes in the dream. Critics have argued that the clock is a luxury project, a monument for the wealthy, or a distraction from the urgent problems of the present. And perhaps there is truth in this. After all, It is easier to think of millennia when you are not struggling for daily survival. Yet even here, there is something worth noting. Every society has left monuments, whether pyramids, temples, towers, or texts. These monuments serve not only as symbols of power, but also as messages to the future. We were here, we thought, we hoped. The clock continues this tradition, but with a twist. It is not built to glorify rulers or conquests, but to remind humanity of time itself. And so when we think of the people behind the clock, we must think not only of Brand and Hillis, or the engineers or the donors, but also of the broader human family that has always dreamed beyond its years. The clock belongs to that family, to the anonymous builders, the forgotten scribes, the nameless hands that carried stone, the dreamers who believed in a tomorrow they would never see. Perhaps this is the true meaning of the clock. It is not just a timepiece, but a gathering of countless human moments, a chorus of lives spent in hope of continuity. Each gear carries not only the weight of steel, but the weight of human faith. Each chamber carved into the mountain holds not only air and silence, but the invisible presence of all who labored for it. When future generations step into that chamber, they will not only hear the clock's slow rhythm, they will, in some way, hear us, the voices of those who dreamed it, built it, and carried it forward. And in that silent conversation across centuries, the clock will become more than a machine. It will become what it has always been, a bridge between the fragile present and the vast eternity that lies beyond it. And so we come to the end of our journey through the story of the clock that measures eternity, a story that began with myths and whispers, passed through the hands of philosophers and inventors, and found its realization in a mountain, where gears turn more slowly than the passing of lifetimes. The clock of the long now is more than an invention. It is a reminder of our place within deep time, a call to think not only of today, but of the generations yet to come. If you have enjoyed drifting with me through this history, I invite you to subscribe and join me again for more stories whispered from the past. Share in the comments where and when you are listening, for each of us becomes part of this long story simply by remembering. For now, dim the lights, rest your thoughts, and let yourself drift into the quiet embrace of history, where time, like the clock, stretches endlessly onward. You are now part of this long chain, a listener who carries the story a little further into the future. If you would like to continue exploring history's strange wonders, whispered gently like this one, I invite you to subscribe and return again. And in the comments, share where and when you are listening, for even this simple act of marking time reminds us that we are connected across places and hours, a community stretched across the map, but gathered here in the quiet. For now, let the lights grow dim, let your thoughts settle, and let yourself rest in the calm embrace of history. Time stretches endlessly behind us and endlessly before us, but tonight, in this small moment, you are exactly where you are meant to be. Good night.